Hey, this is Seth Parnell, minister at the Portia Church of Christ, and this is another episode of the Midweek Bible Study. This is episode 57, I believe. And so I hope that you are doing well. Hope everything is going well your way. Well, I know here in Portia, we lost power for a little bit after those storms. Some storms came through the area and did a little bit of damage around our place. And so it's good to be back online, to have power back, and if you were in the path of one of those storms, I hope that you were all right. Hope that you were safe and that you're doing good now. It's definitely storms can have they can have a lot of power to them. They cause a lot of destruction when they get rowdy, and so it's always good to when there's storms to go through and nobody's hurt. That's always a good thing. We want to let you know that we appreciate everyone whether you're watching this now or you watch it on the replay. We hope that everything's going well for you, and we appreciate you being here. We always want to let you know invitation to come and worship with us at Portia. We're located at 307 South Jackson Street in Portia, Arkansas. And right now we're meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and we're meeting at 6 o'clock on Sunday night and Wednesday night. And so if you're in the area around one of those times, then feel free to stop by. Feel free to come in and worship with us. We'd love to worship God with you and to meet you and get to know you. It would be a good thing. And so we hope that you take advantage of that opportunity if you have it. We also want to let you know that if you have any questions or any comments about what we talk about tonight, or if you ever want to have any questions about the Bible, then please feel free to send them our way. We would love to talk to you about that, and we would love to maybe get to a better understanding of the gospel with each other. But other than that, I hope everything is going well for everyone. We've got a couple of people who have chimed in already. We've got Nadine Mayland. She's watching. It's good to have you guys here. Hope everything's going well over there. And we got Gail Dunlap, Tom and Billy Gale. They're here. It's good to have you guys. And Nancy Medlock as well. And she is here watching. I hope that you guys are doing good. It's always good to see you familiar faces, even if it's virtually, even if it's something where it's not in person, but it is across the internet, and we can still be able to see each other. It's a good thing. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 13, I believe. Mainly 1 Kings 12 and 13, and in that area. We're going to take a kind of a brief look at a man by the name of Jeroboam tonight. Now, recently, we took a look at Jotham, who was one of the kings of Judah. He was one of the better kings, that they had. But kings are often, people who are graded, differently maybe than your average person. We know that to be a king is a lot of responsibility. To be someone who is in that position of leadership, that's a lot to take on. It's a lot to be responsible, for, because you're the one who is leading the people. The decisions that you make affect the lives of thousands of people. And so that's what these kings had to deal with when they came into power, in these Bible times. And we had some good kings and we had some bad kings. And oftentimes when you read throughout this book, of First and Second Kings, you'll when you introduce to a new character, when you're introduced to a new king, it'll often kind of give you right off the bat. It'll tell you how faithful these kings were. It'll give their name and maybe who their parents were. And they were the son of this person, and then it will say this person was either faithful to God or they did not do what was right in the sight of God. And that's usually the formula that the book of First Kings follows. And it's kind of the pattern which it goes throughout the rest, telling about these kings and about the history, of Israel. But Jeroboam is someone who he's one of the kings that kind of is at the beginning. You get down into the middle. There's a lot of kings that maybe get overlooked at times, because of there's not much known about them, or there's not much said about them. But Jeroboam is someone who his name is mentioned a lot throughout the book of First Kings, and it's not for a very good reason. In fact, it's actually for it's a very unfortunate circumstances in which his name is mentioned. But if you're familiar, if you go back to the time of Samuel, Samuel was a prophet. He was a judge. He was someone who was kind of the spiritual leader of Israel. But the people came to him, and they requested a king. They said, give us a king so that he may lead us. He may go before us in battle. We want a king like the other nations around us. And Samuel, who was initially resistant, he eventually, God told him, go ahead and give them what they want, because this is going to follow what I want for them to do. He says they have not rejected you, but they're rejecting me as far as their leader. And so we know that the process of kings who started, Saul was the first king. He was someone who started out faithful to God. He started out as someone who did a lot for the kingdom, but toward the end of his reign, he started going downhill. He started giving in to his fear, and he started to make decisions that were not consistent with what God had told him to do. He started doing things that you can bet he regretted later on, because Saul was someone who, like I said and mentioning before, his reign kind of has a downhill slide. He starts out good, and it only gets worse from there. But then we know the one who took over from him was a man by the name of David, and David is someone who is known for the good things. He is known for being a man after God's own heart. A man who he was a man who has a heart that was that went after God, and that's one of the things that he is known for. And so he is one of the best kings that we read about, because even though he did some terrible stuff, he was someone who always came back to God, and God respected him for that. And then his son Solomon came into power, and Solomon is the wise king. He's known as one of the wisest kings to ever rule, and one of the richest kings to ever rule as well. Israel had unparalleled success under Solomon. The Bible, talks about the extravagance of riches that were in Israel at this time. They were on the top of the world under Solomon. But as we know, as the scriptures say, it's appointed unto man once to die, and then to face the judgment. Solomon couldn't reign over Israel forever, but it came time for him to die and his successor to take his place. And that's where things go pretty wrong for the nation of Israel. In fact, if you take a look at some of the chapters beforehand, we read about how this process of splitting occurred. Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, was set to take the throne, and he did for a very, very short time. But eventually, through some very ill-gotten advice, through advice that was given to him that was where he listened to the wrong people. He listened to the people that he grew up with instead of the advisors that his father had. And because of this, the people of Israel rebelled against him, and they come and they get this man by the name of Jeroboam, and they're going to put him up as their king. Now, Jeroboam was someone who we're introduced to while Solomon is still alive. We're introduced to Jeroboam if you go back to, I think it's verse 11. Verse 11. when he's introduced as someone who Solomon saw a lot of potential in. Solomon, says that he saw that he was an industrious man, and that he was a someone who could get things done. And so he sets him up in a high position, forced labor for the tribe, of Judah. And so you could see Solomon saw something in this man that he liked. He saw that this man was someone who had potential to do great things, and so he put him in a position of authority, and he from all accounts what we read, he succeeded very well in what he was doing. But then you get over to I think it's down to let's see here. And then you get over here, and later on when you get down to the next section of scripture, we find that Solomon actually gets to where he gets scared of Jeroboam, and he tries to put him to death. Jeroboam becomes a threat to Solomon, and so he tries to put him to death, and he flees to Egypt in order to have sanctuary over there. Now, we hear a lot of times in the scriptures when somebody was wanting to escape death, they would flee to Egypt, into a place where they could be safe. And that's what this man did. And so in this whole process of Rehoboam and not listening to the right people, and the people rebelling against Rehoboam, while all this is happening, Jeroboam is he's out in Egypt. But shortly after that, he returns, and he comes back to Israel. And the people, they welcome him back, and they eventually appoint him as king. This was something that was foretold by a prophet, someone who is referred to, I think, referred to as a prophet, and he tells Jeroboam, and he gives him a kind of a symbolic, act. He comes to him, wearing a new garment. And when he meets Jeroboam on the road, and when they're traveling, past each other, he tears his garment into 10 pieces, and he gives them, to Jeroboam. And he says, he tells him, directly, he says that God's going to give you 10 tribes, and this is what you're going to get, and you're going to be a king, over Israel. And of course, we know Solomon didn't like that, so you tried to get him. But now the people have rebelled. They don't want Rehoboam as their king, and so they appoint him as the king over all of Israel. Well, over all the 10 tribes. Benjamin and Judah are still under the rule of Rehoboam, under the line of David. And so this man comes from a relatively obscure position to be someone who is king over Israel. At this point in time, being a king is something that oftentimes it didn't matter how industrious you were, it didn't matter how talented you were, you couldn't just become a king. You had to be in a certain family, you had to have a certain ancestry, in order to make that happen. But this man who comes from out of left field and becomes king of Israel. And it's interesting to see how talented, how industrious he was. But yet, as we find out throughout the story, especially in verse 12, he was a man that would not make the right decisions. And so if you have a Bible, I encourage you to turn to 1 Kings chapter 12. And we're going to read, I think, verses 25 here. We're going to zero in on this portion of Jeroboam's life. He actually has, there's actually quite a bit about Jeroboam that is in the first part of 1 Kings, or in the middle of 1 Kings. And so it's good to take a look at that, and it'd be more than we could cover tonight. But so we're just going to look at the small section here. 1 Kings chapter 12, and starting in verse 25. This is what it says. It says, Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and lived there. And when he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David, if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. Calves of gold. And he said to the people, You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel and put the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin for the people, went as far as Dan to be before one. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from among all people who were not of the Levites. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he made. And he went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel, and went up to the altar to make offerings. And so here, we find that he's someone who, as he starts out as a talented man, someone who had a bright future, but yet he makes one of the same mistakes that one of his predecessors, that the King Saul would make during a lot of his lifetime. He would start looking at his position. He would start looking at people in the in another part of his kingdom, and he would start to let his fear grow inside of him. He'd start to let his fear start to influence his decisions, and he devises this plan in order to keep Israel under his power. He had no doubt heard the stories of Israel and their history when they came out of Egypt. His solution to this problem was to the problem of his people going down to his rivals country in order to worship. He says while they're there, they're going to change their minds, and they're going to think, well, why do we travel all this way when we can just be under this king? He says they're going to change their mind, they're going to kill me, and they're going to follow after Rehoboam. And so he makes this decision to build 2 golden calves, and he sets one in Bethel, which was the south, and one in Dan, which is the very north of the northern kingdom, at both ends of his kingdom. He does that and tells his people, You've gone up to Jerusalem long enough, but now you have gods to worship here. Now you have gods to worship, these golden calves, which for 2 things. We started out by saying when you're in a position of authority, when you're in a position of leadership, your decisions they matter, and they can have an influence over a large amount of people. This was one decision that Jeroboam made that would have severe consequences for the spiritual health of the nation. And also he was someone who no doubt heard about the history of Israel, and heard about how they came from Egypt, and how God delivered them from the Egyptians, how he allowed them to walk over the water, over dry land, and he crashed the water behind them. He delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh. And when they went to Mount Sinai, he no doubt heard the story of how they built a golden calf, and they worshiped that calf, and they were someone who who put it up in a position above God. And so he heard this story, and he thinks, well, that's a good idea here as well. Why don't we follow that example? And it kind of makes you you want to shake him a little, because of all the examples that he could have drawn from, all of the good things that Moses did, and all the good things that God had provided for Israel, of all the things that he could have drawn on as a inspiration for how to lead his people, he picks this one instance in which Israel made a terrible mistake, in which they made a horrible mistake in worshiping this golden calf after God had just delivered them. You makes me wonder if he knew the rest of the story, if he knew how Moses destroyed that calf and how people were killed because of this instance. We always need to be sure that we are someone that you're from the right sources, and that we're someone who puts our the things that we look to in the right place. Because if we're someone who, like him, picks this one of the worst moments in Israel's history as a pattern for what we're going to do, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. That's why as people who live in the church, we're someone who always looks to the scriptures for a inspiration for what we do, for a pattern for our behavior, for instructions, for things to follow in order to draw closer to God. We always look to the scriptures because we know the scriptures are not going to lie to us. We know if the scriptures are truth. They're going to be something that will be for our best benefit. But we can't do like Jeroboam did, and we can't take a small section of scripture and maybe even something that's not, maybe something that is taken out of context, and we can't use that as inspiration for what we're going to do. If Jeroboam had gone a little further back, he could have thought about the power of God to deliver them from the army of Pharaoh and to crash that water on them, and he could have said, well, if God is strong enough to deliver Israel, then he's strong enough to deliver me. And if he told me I'm going to have 10 tribes, then that's what it's going to be. But yet he didn't do that. He let his fear cause him to make these bad decisions, and he chose one of the worst parts in Israel's history in order to follow suit. We can't do that, and we can't be someone who follows the example that he set. Because if you read throughout the book of First Kings and look at all those other kings, like we said, it follows a formula where it introduces a person, tells usually who they were the son of, and then tells whether they were faithful to God or not. One of the phrases that they use is if he followed after the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. If it says that, it means it was an evil king. It means that he was a bad king, because Jeroboam caused the people to sin. He caused them to stray away from God. And we never want to be guilty of that. We never want our behavior to be a reason why someone, is it pushes God away, or someone gets further away from God. We want to live our lives in ways in which our behavior, attracts people to the gospel, and where it uplifts people, it encourages people, not like what Jeroboam is said. If we thought about it, in this way, like if you inserted, your name, in the place of Jeroboam in all these different cases throughout First Kings, if it said that he followed, in your ways, if it followed in, it said if he followed in the ways of Seth, would that be good or would that be bad? Would that be something that be a positive, impact for people? Would that draw people closer to God, or would that, push them further away? What would it be? We need to be conscious, of the way that we interact with others, of the way in which we present ourselves, and the decisions, that we make. We need to be someone that is always looking for an opportunity, to encourage someone, and is looking for an opportunity to show, the goodness of God, to the people that are around us. Because every time, every day we have a decision to make. Are we going to be like Jeroboam? Are we going to have our decisions be something that drives people away from God? Or are we going to be someone that brings them closer? Are we going to be someone that makes them, want to follow God? We have a decision, that to make. And Jeroboam's, legacy would be this mistake, that he made, and this being someone who caused Israel to sin. That would be the legacy that most of the Bible remembers him by. And that's not what we want to be remembered by. We don't want to be someone who's remembered as a who who pushed people away, someone who threw them out. We that's not what we want to be remembered by. And we know there's other cases that we find here of Jeroboam. He has a interaction with a man who's referred to as a man of God, and he would be offering sacrifices at an altar, and a man of God would prophesy against him, and he would point his finger at this man, and he would say, "Seize him," and his hand would stop working. His hand, I think some translations say it withered up. It says something that he lost all strength in it. And so he has to plead with the man of God to pray for him. And he does, and his hand is healed. But Jeroboam was someone who, we read about characters who start out on the right foot, and like Solomon and others, and like Saul, who start out on the right foot but kind of fall away as they go on. But Jeroboam was someone who never really got started on the right foot. But he was someone that was always concerned about what he could do and the power that he held. And because of that, his legacy was that of sin. And so the last thing that we'll probably end on tonight is that if we're someone that is only concerned about how things affect us, and how things work for us, then our legacy is going to be about us. It's not going to be about those worthwhile things that we read about in scriptures. When the scripture says bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, if we're someone that is only concerned about how things will affect me, then our legacy is going to be like that of Jeroboam. And we're going to be someone who misses those opportunities to bring people closer to God. Because there's a very simple command that was given to Israel on Mount Sinai. It's kind of ironic that Jeroboam, he draws this inspiration from that moment in Israel's history. And what was given to Israel at that time? Well, it was the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3, this is what it says here. He says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Very simple, very direct. It's very hard to confuse a command like that. He says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And yet that went over in Jeroboam's head, and he didn't realize what he needed to do. And so we always need to be sure that not only we're drawing inspiration from the right place, but we're also someone who tries to make those decisions that bring people closer to him, and be someone who doesn't put God in the background and doesn't put him over there, but someone who has him as our sole Father, someone who is the very top of what we are, someone who is our priority, and that we have no other gods before him. Because we may not bow down to a wooden statue or a golden calf. I don't think any of us would ever think of doing that. But yeah, there's other things that can take the place of God if we're not careful. If we let that take up so much of our life that it consumes more of our life than what we dedicate to God, then we can have a problem. And we can be someone that ends up making that something more important than what God is. But he says, you shall have no other gods, before me. And so we need, when he says it, we need to take it to heart. We need to meditate on it and see where we stand in relation to commands like this. I hope this is something that has been beneficial to you. And like I said, there's a lot more lessons that you can draw from the life of Jeroboam. He's one of those negative examples that we look at in the scriptures. But if you want if you want to read more about his story, I suggest you read 1 Kings. I think it's from chapter 11 down to is his story. If you want to read it in its entirety, the death of Jeroboam is in chapter 14, and then he's introduced in chapter 11. And so if you want to read his story, the entirety of his story, on your own, then I encourage you to do that. But other than that, we'll be back here next week for another edition of the Midweek Bible Study. I think we have I think it's Caleb Hamilton's going to be with us as a guest, and so I know you're going to enjoy what he has to say, and we'll be looking forward to having you here. We've had a good number here so far, and so we appreciate everyone being here. And like we said, if you're someone who has any questions or comments about what we've talked about tonight, then please feel free to send them my way, and we'll get them. We'll try to study together. But until then, we'll see you next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.